Prior to the mid-20th century, Canada was essentially Britain Junior. The main language was English, the flag was the British ensign, history classes focused on the British perspective of world events. Yet Canada was a land of immigrants, and we were the first country in the world to create an official multiculturalism policy in the 1970s. This helps us to celebrate our differences, attract quality people to our country, and be more tolerant of our differences. However, it can also create a lack of unity and conflicts between groups, as we identify more with our nation than the people in our nation state. It was Prime Minister Trudeau who spearheaded the multiculturalism legislation. He really wanted to create what he called a just society, which focused on Canadian federalism instead of cultural differences. This led to the creation of the white paper discussed in a previous video that would encourage our Aboriginal peoples to be absorbed into the mainstream society. He also rejected any ideas of Quebec separatism and passed the Official Languages Act in order to appease the Francophones in Canada. But these policies really didn't work. The white paper led to the creation of the National Indian Brotherhood that became the Assembly of First Nations, and the support for Quebec separation only increased after passing of the Official Languages Act and Trudeau's use of the War Measures Act to deal with the FLQ. And the NEP only served to increase regional conflicts. We're going to talk about the NEP later in this video. But one thing most Canadians today agree with in regards to Trudeau's just society is his immigration and multiculturalism policies. He truly desired that all Canadians would feel a part of this great nation state and that we would seek out the unique personality that is Canadian, not as a melting pot, but as a mosaic, or as he says here, a tapestry. When his government was in power, Canada became more cosmopolitan as we became more urban, and this exposed us to other cultural practices, not only around the world, but within our own country. One aspect of our multicultural legislation that can highlight this is reasonable accommodation. This law states that we must allow for religious or cultural differences when it's reasonable to do so. This allows us to promote that Canadian attribute of tolerance. But it can also create anxiety as some Canadians fear the loss of other aspects of our identity. The most common example used to illustrate this is the controversy in 1990 over whether or not a member of the Sikh community could become a member of the RCMP and be allowed to wear his turban instead of the Stetson hat. What are your thoughts on this issue? Is this an example of reasonable accommodation to encourage multiculturalism, or a negative step towards Canada losing key aspects of our heritage? And the idea of Canada being a tolerant nation doesn't always hold up when we look at our history. As we've discussed in a previous video, after the railway was built, the government tried to prevent further Chinese immigration by putting a head tax and other restrictions in place. Those family members who could afford to come to Canada faced discrimination as they were unable to vote and could only work in certain areas. This led to the establishment of Chinatowns, but then people would complain that the Chinese weren't integrating enough. And it wasn't just the Chinese who faced immigration restrictions. The 1906 Immigration Act banned immigrants who were seen as undesirable, and that was often based in race, as there was a fear that too many visible minorities would change the Anglo-Saxon makeup of Canada. Besides, supporters said, those people just wouldn't be able to assimilate, which was seen as a good thing then. Doukhobors, Jews, Ukrainians, and immigrants from other Asian nations also faced discrimination. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that the immigration laws were changed to reflect the values that are now outlined in the Multiculturalism Act. Today we welcome people from all around the world. But remember, it's not easy to immigrate to Canada. There's many regulations and sometimes a really long wait. But here's a question. Should we encourage immigrants to identify with their mother country or put more of an emphasis on integrating into Canada? Do you know anyone who says that they're a Jamaican Canadian or Italian Canadian? We call that being hyphenated. Does this help new immigrants feel more comfortable, or does it prevent them from fully adopting a Canadian identity? We want to embrace a pluralistic society, but how do you do this while also encouraging a national identity? So far we've talked a lot about ethnic identity. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about regional identities. Because our country is so vast, our geography can create regional differences, and our conflicting interests can create alienation. For example, our democracy is based on representation by population, which in turn means that Ontario and Quebec are going to have the majority of the political power because they have the majority of the people. That in turn means that provinces like Alberta can feel left out. In the 1980s, there was a sharp increase in the price of oil worldwide, so the Trudeau government enacted the National Energy Policy, which essentially controlled the price that Alberta's oil industries could sell our oil to ensure that Eastern Canada would not be hit as hard by this crisis. Trudeau's reasoning was that, as a nation-state, we should work together to support each other. Of course, those of us in Alberta didn't see it that way. We felt the government was yet again looking to ensure that Eastern Canada was being protected. So what do I mean by yet again? Well, when Canada was first settled, the western regions were sparsely populated and were often seen as just a source of economic resources. Government policies favored the industries in the east more than the extraction of the resources in the west. For example, initially we didn't even have control over our natural resources the way we do today. Instead, government agencies and companies in eastern Canada controlled things. And there'd be tariffs on manufactured goods to ensure that Canadians would buy goods from the east, but these same tariffs didn't apply to our agricultural products, therefore making Western farmers have to compete for markets, and this often led to lower profits. Bank policies focused on how to support the eastern industries versus the western farmers. Government projects were often awarded to the east, and after the Quiet Revolution, the government sure did seem to be paying a whole lot of attention on Quebec and how to keep them happy. This led to Albertans' alienation. By the 1980s, Albertans, much like the Quebecois, decided to use politics to get our voices heard and created a new political party, the Reform Party of Canada, whose slogan was, "The West Wants In." In addition, a separatist party started to gain support. While the Western Canada Concept Party never enjoyed the political successes of the Parti Québécois, it did send a message that Alberta was not happy. And although we now have a Prime Minister that's from Alberta, that doesn't mean we don't still experience conflicting loyalties with other regions of Canada. For example, it wasn't until Stephen Harper's party was in power that Canada left the Kyoto Accord. This made a lot of Albertans happy as this international agreement would impact our economy, but it wasn't supported by the eastern provinces who don't depend on fossil fuels for their economy. Recently, Newfoundland has been able to use fossil fuels to rapidly transform their economy, but it wasn't easy. Their premier had to fight for quite a long time to get control of the offshore oil resources. The idea of separatism in Newfoundland is often bubbling under the surface. In 1948, they held a referendum to join Canada, but only 52% of the region voted to join. That's a lot of people who didn't want to be a part of Canada. And like other areas of Canada, there are Newfoundlanders who feel that Canadian Federation has not helped them, that their nation could do better if they were not part of the Canadian nation-state. The examples of Alberta and Newfoundland illustrate the difficulty of federal-provincial relations. Within our federal system, there are competing interests. Because of the various factors like population and access to valuable resources, some provinces have more power and wealth. Trudeau tried to offset this by establishing equalization payments, which would increase our national unity by providing greater equality across the country for essential services like healthcare. It's like a family. You take care of each other. And while the have provinces can resent these payments, we've always got to keep in mind that your provincial good fortune can change, as Ontario saw after the 2008 recession. Provinces also vie for greater control over international trade relationships. While the federal government officially has authority over foreign relations, those laws can impact regional economies. For example, much of the private investment in the oil industry comes from foreign investors. When the Trudeau government decided to put serious limits on foreign investment, that impacted our economy. Of course, Trudeau had good reasons for this. Foreign investment can limit our control or sovereignty over those valuable resources, and often a large portion of the funds earned by foreign companies ends up leaving Canada. But without that foreign investment, our economy just wouldn't be as strong. So yet again, we can see that groups of people who see participation in the Canadian nation-state have different perspectives. And if loyalty to your national group, be it recent immigrants, a linguistic group, or a regional association, comes first, then that can impact your adoption of a national Canadian identity. Okay, let's repeat that key unit question just one more time. To what extent can or should we embrace a national identity?